Hello, Gabriella.
Okay.
And hi, everyone. Welcome to this chapter of Form by Content, presented by Monash Art, Design and Architecture, and programmed by Monash University Museum of Art. My name is Kate Rhodes, and I'm thrilled to be speaking with artist Gabriella Hurst. For audiences who are listening and would like a visual description, I have brown hair, a fringe, and I'm wearing black. It's nearly 6 o'clock in the middle of winter, so it's getting darker and darker outside. I'm at my local library, Baguna Nayin, which means gather everybody in Wurrung, the language of the Wurundjeri, the traditional owners of the unceded lands I'm on, and so very appropriate for us recording a conversation to share with others. I'd also like to pay my respects to elders past and present. I'm curator at State Library Victoria, and I'm completing a PhD in the architecture and curatorial programs at Monash University. I'm also a gardener, and Gabriella, who is speaking from her home in Berlin at nearly 10 o'clock in the morning, takes this description of Gardner to new and fascinating places that we'll explore in this conversation. Gabriella, can I hand over to you to introduce yourself?
Thank you so much, Kate. Yes, I'm Gabriella Hurst. I'm an artist. I am in Berlin, so right on the other side of the world. Visual description. Um, I am wearing a black shirt. I have dark hair. I'm against a white backdrop in some kind of muted morning light. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation about gardening and care and all the kind of rootings, weavings, and diggings in between. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, that's right. So we've been invited here onto your screens to discuss Gabriella's recent project, How to Make a Bomb, and the way in which she engages the garden as a site of critique and care, as a form of control, and perhaps mundanely as maintenance. Gardens are certainly entwined with care, and when we think about its connection to humility, empathy, practicality, and patience. But even more fresh than How to Make a Bomb is Gabriella's related project, Battlefield. And we're going to start there today. So, Gabriella, you opened the current iteration of Battlefield. It's a project you actually started in 2014, just last week at the Kunsthalle Osnabrück, which is about a 3 hour train trip, you told me, from where you are now in Berlin. Can you describe Battlefield for people who might not know it? Introduce us to some of the vast and complex terrain that you're exploring, like, as you said, the cultural and historical entanglement of gardening, military violence, nuclear colonialism, and plant naming, amongst other ideas. And maybe take us back to the beginning too about where this idea comes from.
Great. Yes. Where to start with Battlefield is always a bit complicated because it is a really leaky project that is a kind of about continued maintenance and continued care, and it doesn't part of kind of the issue, but also the core of it is that it is kind of unresolvable, and that's the point of it. I'll start with kind of how I began it. So um, Actually, maybe with a small anecdote that we had kind of vaguely discussed beforehand. But I grew up on Camaraga land in Sydney, and my dad. So we had a big backyard. My dad had this and still has this habit of whenever we'd get back home, or even on like the hottest midsummer day, first thing in the morning, he would go out into the garden and with a range of tools, shears, uh, an arsenal of gardening tools. And he would go out into the garden, and then at a certain point, he would come back covered in tick bites and scratches, and he'd just like, and sweating, and he'd just bandage himself up, and then just like have a big glass of water, and he'd just go straight back out
He
to
was really
combat.
selling gardening to you as a pursuit.
Yeah, so I really wasn't a gardener as a child because it wasn't appealing, but it definitely had this sense of like going into conflict with the garden.
Of it
And
being consuming. Oh, he was obviously very intensely dedicated.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And because of that, we always had a very beautiful garden that was the result of his constant physical labor into this place. And this is, of course, wrapped up in so many kind of like in the case of Australia, wrapped up in so many ideas of like, I guess like conquering a place that is perhaps like not understood and needs to be managed and organized within a colonial way, but it's also more complicated than that as well, because it is perhaps about like about care and about caring for your environment. So it's mixed up in that place between conquest and care and like settler colonial identity in Australia. And of course, like I grew up with the backdrop as well on the TV of things like Backyard Blitz and Gardening Australia that kind of shift between a very kind of tender approach to looking at plants um, and yeah, the language of warfare to blitz, to kind of like to totally overhaul a
Yeah,
space.
yeah. Annihilate and change and
Exactly. So and you know, there are so many avenues to go with in kind of introducing kind of my interest in the relationship between gardening and conflict as like two kind of ways of thinking about habitat. Um, but yeah, that's kind of, I guess if I kind of think about that, that's kind of one starting point. But Battlefield itself, as like an ongoing research project that I've been doing since 2014, began when I moved to Europe, and I came across this plant called Verdun. It's a rose called Verdun, and I had, as Kate, I'm sure you did too, had this kind of deep indoctrination into the history of World War One as being kind of like a stalwart of um, history of teaching. I remember like listening to doing a minute of silence for World War One, kind of that was almost 100 years later, and just thinking about World War One as part of kind of like the upkeep of an Australian colonial identity. But so I knew a disproportionate amount of information about the Battle of World War, about the Battle of Verdun when I turned up age 23 in France. I like had statistics and facts, and I also knew about it as a place, as a battle that had been a real battle of the earth that was fought over a very small area of land. There were periods of time in this bloody conflict where 3 meters of land were kind of like mashed backwards and forwards and composted with weaponry and with bodies. And so when I found out about this rose that was made in 1918 that was called Verdun, I was just super curious about what this rose was. And I knew that there was this family, just by internet research, that were trying to bring this rose back into circulation in line with the 100 years anniversary of Verdun. So I ended up visiting Verdun, staying with this family who were really lovely, and starting to think about how histories of a place, this in the case of the city of Verdun, but also of like an almost 100-year-old act of war or conflict, how they are memorialized through planting and through gardening, and in this case, through the story of this particular rose, this one particular rose being revived. And in visiting Verdun, it kind of all came together because the place where the Battle of Verdun happened, there are forests there that were not there before the war. They were planted over the site of this conflict and then engineered to have the characteristics of a forest that's now 300 years old instead of 100 years old. So considering like forestry as a form of gardening as well, through which history is managed and
yeah.
through which violence is either pushed away or kept close, but how memory is tended to, and like statecraft is created through gardening. So these are all the things that kind of started coming together through this like small little pink rose that I after visiting Verdun, I was gifted one, took it home. Was not great at gardening. It died because I tried to keep it in my flat because I had not learned how to garden from my dad at that point.
There's something quite poetic, I guess, about that rose dying, maybe too, sort of this sort of go full cycle with the
Yeah, exactly, because you have this like monument that you suddenly feel this responsibility for.
Yeah.
And even if you're like, I don't want to be like the kind of custodian and caretaker of like a World War One battle, like somehow you are wrapped up.
Yeah, exactly. You become a part of the piece of the story.
Exactly. And like you're responsible for this plant, which is just a kind of nice little plant that, as it's a cultivated growth, particularly if you're keeping it inside, not advisable. Is really dependent on you to water it and look after it.
Yeah, those mundanities, that the of maintenance.
Yeah. So you find yourself being this like caretaker of a monument, but the
Yeah.
monument is so fragile in a way.
Yeah.
And yet, it scratches you and you try and prune it and yeah. But anyway, so
Well, this is kind
because
of
it died,
exemplary, isn't it, of Battlefield?
totally. So then I got another one and I started expanding this research into other plants that are named after battles. And I needed to keep them alive. I needed to do better than I had done with Verdun. And so I started collecting them and actually growing them on the Tempelhofer, which is it's a former airport. It's a very loaded site. It used to be a parade ground during National Socialism. Before that, it had kind of older history during Prussian wars. It then became a civilian airport, and most recently it became a public park. And again, this thing about like making a loaded site into a park, it's always like, what do we do with this violent place? I guess we'll make it into a park, like a memory garden.
Yeah, well, it's the thing, I guess. I mean, parks can be very contemplative spaces. I guess like the forest in Verdun, they, in a way, they enforce a sort of reflection, perhaps. You're lying on the grass or you're walking through the forest or they are places that make us think. But whether we think
I
about
totally agree.
the
But
past.
also, like, it's that line between, like, do they make you think or do they also just, like, create a side of peace?
Yeah, yeah.
And that in its own
They
right.
paste over things.
Yeah, like, or overgrow what is kind of lying underneath. And that's also, there's like a tension there that, like, it almost neutralizes violence in a way.
Yeah.
To garden over it.
Yeah, it tries to transform it, I suppose.
Exactly. Yeah. So basically started gathering all these plants, doing more research into plants that were named after battles and warfare, and expanded kind of the gamut of what that meant to just include like the language of the kind of theatres of war in general, mainly European battles from 1500s up until the present day. And so Battlefield expanded. I actually left Berlin in the meantime. The community gardens there. It's in a community garden on the Tempelhofer Feld. They were caring for them in my absence. I was going backwards and forwards. And this project, I was always trying to find an outcome for it that it could be like, because I was just going there and tending to it and doing sketches of these plants and always trying to think of like something still that I could make to represent this research project. And it always felt really dead if I tried to do that. It wasn't what the work was. The work was about, I guess, a performance project of being wrapped up in this process of caring for these weirdly named, often kind of unpleasantly associated plants.
You were telling me about one called Margaret Thatcher. That must have been quite a hard plant to tend.
So Margaret Thatcher is, all these stories started coming out through the gathering of these plants and the research of looking for them and trying to find out their names throughout all these really fascinating things. So Margaret Thatcher is a gladiolus that was made in 2001, so really recently, by a Czech breeder, Peter Schmider. And I emailed Peter Schmider and was like, so what's the story of the Margaret Thatcher gladiolus that you brought out last year? And his response, actually, I can find it. Margaret Thatcher. So I've made this publication of Battlefield of all the plants, an index of all the plants. And Margaret Thatcher is planted next to Falklands fuchsia made in 1984. But Peter Schmider
Perfect.
and their roots are weaving together, which I think is something. So Margaret Thatcher, Peter Schmidt's response was, I can only inform you about my variety, Margaret Thatcher. I'm 37 years old, so I have no experience in her political career as British Prime Minister, but I have read her book and respect her as a right-wing and conservative politician whose voice is missing from the current madness. I respect her as a charismatic and intelligent woman, and I realize that there is no longer any political figure of her caliber. I've therefore decided to dedicate to her at least my pink gladiolus, which I selected in 2014.
Wow. I mean, it intensifies the project, doesn't it? It gets around to this conversation about how do we discuss those things which repel us? How do we kind of not push things to the side, but bring them into the light in order to have it out with them, to have these discussions. But a discussion in a way or a one-off work is one thing, but a plant is long-term. It's really an endurance piece.
Yeah, and Margaret Thatcher is going to be hopefully alive for. Am I really saying this sentence? That's what happens. I find myself saying things like Margaret Thatcher is forever, and then I'm like, what sort of horrible?
Because of you.
That's the thing. But I guess it would be the thing if I was only raising Margaret Thatcher, that would be one thing. But it's the bringing of all of these different plants together that I hope it becomes like a weird performance research project where all of these plants have to kind of place you in a complicated situation.
Yeah.
Where something that some of these plants have these names that seem, maybe pompous, but at least abstract in terms of their violence. So unknown warrior, and that the idea of the unknown warrior seems, and then the plant that I'm thinking about in particular was I think it was I thought it was a Napoleonic one, but then it wasn't because it was called unknown warrior in English. Anyway, it's from at least 100 years old, and it has this kind of romanticism of the lost soldier. So a plant like that, it's tending to its title and itself is one thing, but then
although meanings shift, don't they? You were telling me about a lady from Ukraine, and she had a very different kind of feeling towards this idea.
So she came to the garden and we were speaking, and she was like, of all the plants, this is the one that really hits home because of what's happening in her home at the moment. And it was interesting to me that was the plant of all of them that kind of felt the most poignant and relevant, even though it was named after this older battle. And you just recognize that language goes from being peaceful and civilian to just being deployed out into violence again. And there are a lot of plants like that. This idea of so the installation that I've made at Osnabrück is an expansion.
Can you describe it for us?
Yes. So, and I can also show you a drawing of it. But it is a garden of almost 200 of these species of plant that have been organized into this formal garden installation in this cloister.
Wow, that is beautiful.
But as seeing, I think it's interesting that, because this is the drawing that I did, that it becomes this kind of plan and this map. But yeah, the installation is this structure of almost 200 plants, and where they're planted in proximity to one another also kind of starts to tell a bit of a story. So the plants that I gathered that are all referencing World War II battles are planted in proximity to one another. But I steered away from labeling that group, World War II battles, and instead have labeled all the different beds within this garden with words that cross over between the language of warfare and the language of gardening. So border, tend, divide, pinch, invasive, overgrowth, undergrowth, which was difficult because of course it's being shown in Germany. So translating those is its own kind of kettle of fish. But yes, so this is how it's kind of manifested in this particular garden, all of these different plants together. But I've forgotten what I was saying, I'm sorry.
Well, what about, can you tell us about the project that started in 2014 in the community garden? And talk us about how you've involved the community, you know, with their labour, you know, co-opting them in a way to be your co-carers, particularly when you're not there, um, and their maybe shared interest in the idea of care with this project, particularly, you know, when some of the names of those plants might be challenging, offensive even. Yeah, how we've involved others with this idea of care.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of opening up this project to other people, ideally with their consent, um, and to, because this thing that I was saying beforehand, that like I was trying to always kind of make a series of paintings or something from that, and at the crux of it, I realized what interests me about this project is the actual performance of caring and tending as a long-term project that like the upkeep of history, like it never ends. Margaret Thatcher plant requires endless care over a duration period of time, and her name will mean different things at different times, and that plant will require different needs at different times. So like sharing that with other people is the practice in a way, if given the opportunity to do so, and showing it at Osnabrück has been like an expansion of that, that the Kunsthalle has been invited to do that, and people in the city have been invited to kind of partake in it. There's a lot of workshops, and like winter, like this is done in Europe, so protecting things during the winter and wrapping them up and them kind of dying over different periods of time, and then like saving their seeds and this kind of continual muscular labor.
Yes, it's that back to the performance again. You know, it is always a sight to see. Often, you know, you have the sculptures being wrapped up and plants going through their cycles of change, kind of performance in themselves.
And what sort of story does that tell if all of the Falklands fuchsias die off when it gets too cold? And what is the kind of like, or if, you know, the labels accidentally get mixed up at a certain time, once they throw their labels off, do they have to carry that history?
Well, yeah, you were telling me about. Oh, sorry, Gabrielle. You were telling me about actually in the winter in particular, where the apparatus of gardening starts to become perhaps more at the fore, where the labels themselves, you know, become quite dominant in the garden beds because everything has died away.
Absolutely. So when I went to Osnabrück to do a site visit the first time, I went to the Botanic Gardens, which was where at first the installation was going to be, and turned up there. And I mean, botanical gardening and horticultural gardening, I've learned are very different. Like all the plant names that I have are cultivar names. So they're the names that breeders have placed onto those plants, usually for a market. So these names suggest a market. They are whatever is marketable at that time. But just this idea of like a garden of labels as like something really impressive to go to the botanic garden, and like what you see more than anything else is just like all of this language. And it kind of occurs to me that it's the language that's being gardened as much as the plants itself. It's about the upkeep of order and about the upkeep of the certain kind of naming structures that have been placed onto those plants that can also so easily slip away. I mean, obviously an expert can tell the difference, but a lot, and I now with most of my plants, I can recognize them from one another, but I lost a few of the labels of them when I was preparing and moving them around. There are all these auriculas that were named by this guy in his 80s who's made like 600 auriculas. He's in the UK, and he named them all after First World War battles. Because I spoke with him on the phone, he was just like, well, I'd been to France at that time, and I was interested in war, so I named them after that. I'd run out of family members to name them after. But they all arrived with no labels on them, and they all look, to me, absolutely identical until they flower. And so there is this thing about like gardening language and gardening a certain archive and a certain way of organizing the world. That of course is like wrapped like back to like Linnaeus and the colonial naming of plants, but also just like, I guess in my practice in general, I'm interested in the upkeep of certain archives of power and like how mundane that maintenance is. I think you used, or banal that maintenance is, like that, like what to upkeep things in certain categories, like who actually does that, and of course, there's like big libraries where that is happening, but who's actually going and cleaning and organizing those bits of paper, and what kind of like human error happens in there?
And to whose benefit, I suppose, are we keeping this history? Um, and, are plants, will they respond as much to taste? Will names change for the same plants? That kind of thing. I think you've got examples of that. And, I mean, it is interesting, and I know you've got some labels, just how sort of uniform in a way plant labels tend to be with the hierarchy of the left hand and the right, the top, I think it's top left hand corner and bottom right hand corner, and the space around the center of the name. You see that again and again in labels. So this idea of sort of everyone being very diligent, um, following this order of plant names, whether there's and where that comes from.
Yeah, and also like how the plant sits against that. Like, what does it mean when a plant actually throws off its characteristics? And
Yeah, morphs and changes because of climate issues and influence from other plants.
yeah, and we worked with a really wonderful graphic designer, Jasper Otto, who found a font that is the font that's, or like a knockoff, kind of slightly weird version of the font that is used in botanic labels. And so kind of like the aesthetics of order and structure in that is something that we were playing with as well. So yeah, I have Foreign Legion
Yeah,
here.
right.
I have Friendly Fire as well, which was an iris in this case. Yeah, an iris. And what I found interesting in this, which is what I learned because I speak German, but my German as well is kind of quite conversational. But learning that, for example, this iris that we call like a German iris or a bearded iris, its botanic name is Deutsche Schwertlily, which means sword lily. And so recognizing, I guess, where like the language of conflict, because of the way they come out of the earth.
Yeah.
And these are sort of things that I've tried to tie into the project. Because even though the project has this very kind of like serious element of like upkeep of history, it's also kind of about gossip and how history in the sense of gardening is made. Like you have these very strict ways of organizing things that are like this, but then like gardening history as opposed to perhaps botanic history is a lot about like garden notice boards and like, well, Kate, you have a lot of experience in growing in community gardens and like the sort of conversations that happen there.
Yeah. And the seeds that just get left in a huge tray saying, help yourself. Sometimes you don't know what you're picking up. But I guess there's a
And
lot
I
of
would go there.
commercialization wrapped up in this too. These kind of, they're given kind of flashy, memorable, um, names of frisson for a commercial market. So people will pick them up out of the hundreds of things that you could buy in your seedling tray. Yeah, those names are also shouting out to be noticed for that reason.
And in one context, those names might be so normal and exciting, and in other ones they might be so violent and horrendous. And like most of the plants that I have are older plants, and so they kind of have, a bit of time behind them where you can step back and be like, and feel some kind of distance of history, which in its own right is exactly what I'm interested in, like how far things get from the point of violence that they stop to kind of lose their violence and they become kind of softer and civilian and how then they might kind of come back. But and also then how they need to be gardened perhaps to stop them from coming back or observed and how you might be involved in that. But like for example, one of the most recent plants I have was made in 2013 and it's called Den Pobedi and it was made in Russia and it is a phlox and which is a perennial. And Den Pobedi means Victory Day. It's the 9th of May. It's this day that celebrates the Russian victory over National Socialist Nazis. And it's a day that, particularly recently was when I was here in Berlin, there was a lot of fear over what would happen with the invasion of Ukraine of the day, whether that was going to be like symbolically a day that there was going to be that Putin was going to do something particularly atrocious that day, and also how that might with the communities here in Berlin, how that might be experienced. So it's kind of like, even though it means like victory salute, that World War II piece like act that happened has now of course been brought back to fire up populations within this particular time. And I'm interested in how that kind of manifests in the horticultural market. And so this particular rose, this particular phlox was being sold in an Austrian nursery. So I've gotten all my plants from various different places, including a lot of commercial nurseries. And on their website, they said this Austrian nursery that was called Pobody. It's a kind of the equivalent to Heil Hitler. And so we don't think that plants should have political connotations, and we don't support this, but it's just such a wonderful red. We just really wouldn't do without it. And so it's just like this thing where like the mundanity and kind of almost like the commercial market and kind of like there's almost a sweetness there, but it's kind of grotesque, like how that fits against the kind of like sword of the name. And like, I don't know, they would like, there aren't many red phloxes. So I guess that's why they've kept it, and it's a big seller. And there are instances where plants, because, you know, their name isn't marketable or because it starts to seem too grotesque, they've changed the name. Like there was an orchid that was made in during World War II in America that was called, in USA, that was called Catalia Joseph Stalin. And then some years later, as kind of like post-war tensions between Russia and America USA started picking up, the breeder actually went back to the Horticultural Society and officially got the name changed to Catalia Joseph, General Patton.
Just forget all that other stuff. Yeah.
But like one who was like acceptable. So yeah, there's like different histories are told in this weird way. But
well, that's a good segue maybe to, you know, this incredibly named rose, the atom bomb. Let's focus on that for a second now, and tell us about this particular plant, how you're using it in your work. And I was also so impressed, and I recommend to anyone listening to check out Gabriella's Rose Garden Conference. This chain of researchers and artists that you brought together as a result of that project too. Tell us about how to make a bomb.
So how to make a bomb stemmed from this research. I came across this plant in the course of Battlefield that was called the Rosa Floribunda atom bomb, made in 1953 in Germany by Cordes, which is a big rose breeder. And I became really fascinated by this plant because it just seemed to really pinpoint and be the most kind of like absurd, but also just like mind-blowing that someone would call a plant atom bomb and put it onto the horticultural market where people were supposed to buy it. So I was curious about the market, I was curious about the breeders, but most of all I was curious about what it would be like to actually tend to a plant that has such violent language attached to it. And it was really hard to find. It's gone almost completely out of circulation, but I was very lucky, and a rose breeder, a rose kind of archive in Italy offered to graft me one from the one that they still had in their collection. And then about 2 years later, I received that plant, and from that developed this project, How to Make a Bomb, because of course I only had one, and I have a dodgy track record of keeping roses alive, so I was like, I better make more because it's really precious. And so I started learning how to graft roses so that I could make more of these. And whilst I was doing that, of course, I was living in the UK. I had done a residency in Scotland that was really close to where the entirety of, or something like 80% of the British nuclear arsenal are kept, right near Glasgow. And so I was thinking about nuclear weaponry while I was there. It's very hard not to use submarines going past. And I was thinking about the British testing at Maralinga in Montebello Island as an act of the nuclear testing. I mean, in short, I guess, acts of nuclear colonialism, of detonating nuclear weapons on Australia and failing to clean up, and all of the horror that happened in the 1950s with this episode of history and of British colonialism and Australian complicity. So I was thinking about this and how this happened at the same time as the rose was made, and developed this project which was inviting people and teaching people how to graft their own atom bomb rose. By this time, I was about 2 generations into the breeding with a curator called Warren Harper. Yeah, so we started breeding this rose with people, and the site where we located this project is a place called Southend-on-Sea in Essex. It's very close to where the nuclear weaponry that was developed and then tested on unceded lands in Australia, where it was assembled before being sent off. So Warren and I, with one generation of atom bomb roses that we'd made, at that point I think it was like 25 atom bomb roses that we'd made, we made this public sculpture as part of this festival, called Estuary Festival, and we planted them there in a garden bed that was shaped like, according to the architectural plans of the Weaponry Test Centre, the weaponry, what am I calling it? Where they develop the weapons nearby, diagonal shape. And we planted these atom bomb roses there. We surrounded them by a line of this other plant that was made around the same time that's called the Cliffs of Dover. Lily that was placed there, or the iris that was placed there. And we had these benches around it that had plaques on it that drew attention to this period in history of British nuclear weapons being tested on Australia, and also to the fact that nuclear weapons are not something of the past, that that current British government continues to proliferate nuclear weapons. And in the meantime, we invited people to come and proliferate their own rose as a means of engaging with that. And the local, they were fine, it was in place for a few weeks, and then...
And for all intents and purposes, it looks like almost it could be a domestic garden or a local council garden. You know, it's quite simple, it's got all the elements that we know very well, that we can identify as a garden.
In a way, it's incredibly innocuous.
Yeah.
It's and it has benches to, you know, sit there with the roses and discuss this. We made a publication. But a few weeks into it, one of the local councillors took great issue with some of the wording of the signage that we had called Britain a colonial nuclear state, and we had said that by continuing to proliferate nuclear weapons and to invest in the proliferation of nuclear weapons, the British government has invested in industries of violence, has made a choice to invest in industries of violence as opposed to those of care. Took great issue with the signage, wanted us to take down the signage. They're very happy with us to leave the roses without the label of them being called Rosa Floribunda Atom Bomb, which I think in its own right is really interesting.
Absolutely.
And there was this like back and forth that happened where basically we were told we needed to take it down in 48 hours or they would take it to the right-wing press and they would take it down themselves. We wanted to keep it up there, and the organization that we were working with basically made the call that they didn't want to have the conversation about nuclear colonialism played out in the Sun and the Mirror, and they took it down. So this is kind of the chaos that happened, and then we, in response to this and the discussion that kind of came afterwards, we organised this conference, the Rose Garden Conference, which invited various different voices to come and actually discuss this history, this chapter of nuclear violence and how it lingers on. People like Timothy Hawkins, Johannes Guest, David Burns, also people who had worked at that the site of the nuclear weapons development nearby. So this is kind of how we ended up having to try and keep that conversation going. And we also organised a big rose gardening rose grafting workshop where people from Southend were invited to come and graft their own rose. And it's actually only now I keep getting these pictures from people who came and took part of the workshop about how they had atom bomb roses growing in their gardens, and how they're wanting to organise their own workshops to continue this carrying on. So this is what happened with the How to Make a Bomb project, and will continue to keep happening because it's as long as the roses are there and people are engaging with them and talking about them, that's where the project is located.
And maybe the censorship, ironically draws attention to the project in other ways. It disperses the ideas that you're interested in exploring, gets rethinking about that history, um, and the involvement from our governments. It's not an issue that's going away. Certainly, nuclear keeps coming back up in conversations in Australia about new sources of power. Um, Unfortunately, remains relevant.
Ever more so. I mean, and it's a really hard thing to talk about. I mean, when I came to working with the Atom Bomb Rose, I didn't know how to talk about nuclear warfare. It was something that I didn't want to talk about. I felt like also it was something that was kind of, this is so naive, but I really thought it was something of the past. I grew up being like, well, when your generation might have the issues of climate change. However, when my parents grew up, they were like, well, we just had, mad theory, like big guns faced at one another. But at least that's not the issue anymore. But of course, it still is.
Totally.
And nuclear weapons never go away, and they're being. We can just see what's happening right now, and it's always in the background or the foreground. And it's really hard to talk about something that is that apocalyptic and catastrophic. And I find that actually working with the Rose is one way that you can work with it, because it's also slightly absurd. It actually is very absurd to have an atom bomb rose, but nuclear weapons are absurd.
And clearly nothing benign about it. That there was enough that the garden, it was clearly enough in that to invoke this response. That people didn't wanted it removed. They're not interested in, ironically, this kind of more interested in a collective forgetting. And really, how is that possible?
Of course, that didn't happen, because by it being taken down, there became a much larger conversation than there would have been. But something that I always think about is that the guy who wanted to be, I've actually forgotten his name, which is interesting. He said that one of the things that he said in his kind of emails was that actually the British government is, in response to us saying that the actions of that Britain was supporting industries of violence as opposed to those of care by making nuclear weapons. He was saying, well, actually, the British government is caring for its people by the proliferation of nuclear weapons. And I think that is really interesting in its own right. And that is a really important part of the discussion, because that's where, like when we talk about the gun debate in America at the moment, like, where do the lines of care and control and suppression and the use of a weapon to apply care, like what is that, and how do we talk about that? And he brought that in, and it would have been great to have that as part of the discussion. But yeah, particularly now there's all this discourse around care within the arts, and this, of course, what we're talking about is care. Like, where does care become something that entirely shuts down a discourse or keeps people silent?
And maybe this is a sort of segue to, we've only got time for one more question that I want to ask you about performance, which is always there in your work. And obviously in kind of, getting in dialogue with those people who wanted to suppress the work, the organisation who was supporting you to put it on in the first place. In a way, there's kind of constant public performance of your interest in making work in the public realm. Often in your work we see you, sort of literally as a performer, but sometimes you're an instructor. We've talked about your incredible work, Force Majeure, that sees you trying semi-successfully to paint a storm in a storm. I've heard you speak about how that work came about, and this trying to catch a storm on film, and the sort of rehearsals in doing that and describing what you were wearing, almost like a costume. As I said, you provide these hands-on plant grafting workshops with the How to Make a Bomb project. You've made a performance dressed as a plant. You've recorded a song. You're a really legitimate performer, Gabriella.
Legitimate, I don't know.
You're on SoundCloud.
That was cool.
And your performances aren't always about plants, but can you talk about perhaps the relationship between the natural world and performance in your practice? And is there a relationship between care and performance? Whether it's about comic exchange or just talking or listening, and respect for and from audiences when working in this way. Can you talk about that a little bit?
I don't know how to answer that. I mean,
It's a very long-winded
really
question.
No, but it's a really good question. I mean, I guess when it comes to like performance and the natural world, it's like I'm really interested in these attempts to capture that have occurred and like to still and organize that like happen within a lot of like archive making, whether that be like the containment of a storm within like the confines of the painted canvas, or in Darling Darling, the film that I made last year, about the attempts to kind of keep a painting within the National Collection still like visually consistent through conservation efforts. I'm interested in all of these activities as performance projects because there's no end to them. The upkeep of stasis, or an illusion of stasis, is like a constant procedure, and it doesn't stop. And it feels so fragile because keeping an archive still, or keeping a painting still, or keeping a garden still is, or like looking a certain way within what's considered to be within your scheme of things, like acceptable or not like totally out of control and chaotic. Like those efforts are you're always about to be overwhelmed.
Yeah.
And so and I guess for me, like art making is that. It's just like you could pick from anything to make anything. You could make anything, and that's like overwhelming. So you have to pick your confines, and the process of like attempting to find those confines is absurd. And yes, I guess that's kind of where I'm coming from with like performance and like natural world, is like my own kind of like anxieties about that, but also like riffing off other like attempts to control, whether that be like the legal framework of the concept of force majeure as like a legal clause of like that was in my contract within the making of that work, which was like, if you get out of making this work in the case of force majeure, an act of God that would interfere with you being able to make an artwork. So yeah, that's kind of the thing. But in terms of it also just like being performance, yeah, I just think it all comes down to performance. Like if you're making a painting, you're performing. You're making decisions of like what to still and what to keep in and what to leave out and where those boundaries are. And the most exciting part is that. And so if you can invite people into that, then great. Maybe they don't want to. But that's just, I don't know. I'll probably be unpicking that for a while. What do you think?
This is always good. Well, thanks for letting us in to your world. This short conversation. It'd be lovely to keep on going.
Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, it's a pleasure to kind of try and unpick some of this stuff and stop and talk about it on the way. And the conversations change, and sometimes it's very serious and sometimes it's very funny, and all of the time it's like arbitrary in a way. But yeah.
And the garden reminds us of all of those things, doesn't it?
Yeah, and
it's a great interlocutor. Yeah.
Sorry?
The garden is a great interlocutor. It's a teacher. It's a companion. Sometimes it's a real pain because it requires constant care. Yeah.
It's something to like fight against and with and like reflect upon and tend to and like have a lovely like relationship with at the same time.
Yeah.
I'm covered in scratches at the moment. Bites and stings and dirt that will never leave me. So I've taken on, I guess. I become my parents.
There you go. It all comes around. Well, thank you, Gabriella.
And the chat and yeah.
Okay. Thanks again, and thanks on behalf of Monash too.